I guess this is significant to me because it was like my first experience of love got ripped away from me over and over and over again. And I wasn't old enough to really understand what was happening to me. Like I couldn't really process the heartbreak I was feeling. But it was like me and her, we had this deep love. And I mean, it's hard to even say it was romantic, but we loved each other. We really did. It started at, 7, 8 years old, and it went on, I'd say, until I moved to Florida. She'd come stay at my house for a week. We would have this week together. We would fall in love all over again. And then she would leave and I would get heartbroken all over again. And I don't know. I think that's formative on some level. It shaped me in a lot of ways. And then our relationship really ended when I moved in with my dad at 13. The next time I saw her after that, she was married. Welcome to the Conscious Love Show. My name is Shane Kohler. I've spent over a decade helping women understand the unconscious patterns driving their relationships and what it actually takes to change them. I'm one of the most direct voices in the modern relationship space and the person who will tell you the truth that most coaches are afraid to name. This show is for anyone who's done settling, done shrinking, and done wondering why love keeps falling short. I'm not here to make you feel better about patterns that aren't serving you. I'm here to name them, help you understand them, and learn how to change them. If you're ready for that, I'm glad you're here, and let's get into it. So today I'm going to do something a little bit different. And for my longtime listeners, if you've been with me a while, you've probably come across at least one or two of the Shane's Diary episodes. And for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, the Shane's Diary episodes was a time once a month where I would sit down to record something a little more personal, almost like a journal entry. And it's been a while since I've done that, but I'm going to bring it back for the next few months. And once a month, I'm going to do a Shane's Diary series where I'm going to record my life story from the time I was born till the day my daughter was born. And this is for anyone who, if you've been with the work for a while, if you've been listening in, if you've followed me and the evolution of the work since it began. And I know some of you, I get messages all the time. You tell me I've listened to every single episode. So this series is for those of you who have been with me for a while, who have been immersing yourself in the philosophy and the context that I present on the show. And you want a deeper look into exactly where that comes from. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break down the entire story, like I said, from my birth to my daughter's birth. And if you listen to this entire series, you're going to hear it unfold in 3 specific arcs. The first arc is going to be my conditioning, how my worldview was shaped, and the environment that made me. The second part is going to be my liberation, when I broke the generational patterns, when I stepped out of them and I started to create something new for myself and what my journey was like actually doing that. And then the third part of this is going to be my creation, what I did on the other side of that, building my home, my family, my relationship with my wife, my daughter, right? It's going to be how life unfolded for me on the other side of that conditioning. And like I said, this is for any of you who have been with me for a long time and you followed my journey and you want to know kind of the things that I've never shared. A lot of you have heard bits and pieces of the story, but you've never heard the whole thing beginning to end. And I'm going to share a lot of things here in this series that I've never shared anywhere else, at least not publicly. So it's for all of you, and it's also for my daughter. And I know there's going to come a time when my daughter's going to want to know who her father was. And so I'm recording this for her as well. And one day when she's however old she'll sit down and she'll be able to have the story from everything that happened before she came into the world. And there's one other thing I want to mention as I begin this story. As I was sitting here preparing for today's episode, I was having all these thoughts come to my mind, people are going to find this boring, or you're going to just sound like you're complaining about your whole life, or if you're not, giving them value directly about, their problems, it's not even worth it, or it's not worth listening to. And I was having, all of these kind of, ego stories come up in my mind. And I stopped for a moment and I said to myself, like, this is just you not wanting to be seen. And I thought, that's my blueprint, and I've been working with the relational blueprints a lot on the show lately. And I was like, that's my blueprint. It's like that somewhat of a caretaker blueprint, where if I don't feel like I'm doing something for you specifically or taking care of you, that I don't matter. And I wanted to name that at the beginning here too, because I want to put it in the space for those of you who are going to be following me on this journey, that part of what I'm doing here is I'm working through the very thing in myself that I coach all of you to work through every day. And I just want to name that because, maybe it's an important part of the story that this is still alive in me. And what this is, as I talk about the arc from conditioning to liberation to creation, it's not to say that the blueprint has been overcome or eradicated. It's just no longer the thing that limits me in my life. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm recording it anyway. I'm sharing the story anyway, even though I think some people might find it boring, or some people may not care, or some people might be like, why is he doing this? This doesn't have anything to do with me. But I'm doing it anyway because I'm not limited by that thing in myself anymore. And I wanted to name that as we go into this series. So I'll start at the beginning, and something my grandpa's told me my entire life, which I find a little bit hilarious, is that on the day of my birth, I was driven to the hospital in a Cadillac and I was driven home in a Mercedes. And it's one of those weird facts about my life that is basically insignificant, but my grandpa's always said it. And it's kind of a weird thing because I was born into a very poor family. My grandfather kind of did odds and ends his whole life. My grandmother didn't work, and they were like simple working class people from Kansas. And I don't even know how that thing with the Cadillac and the Mercedes happened. I know that at the time my grandma had a Cadillac and my grandpa had a Mercedes, and it was probably some time of relative stability where they got a good deal on a couple cars, but they didn't have them for long because they weren't there when I was growing up. I never even saw my grandma's Cadillac as far as I remember. And my grandpa's Mercedes, it was one of those things like when I was very, very young, I remember being like, do you want to go for a ride in the Mercedes? And it was like a big deal. But I don't know, they must have not been able to afford the upkeep on them or something, and they ended up getting rid of them. But it's one of those interesting things because I guess I always felt like it was a kind of an omen for me. Like somehow I was meant to rise above that environment. And that's really been the story of my life, is rising above the environment that I came from. Another thing that's kind of interesting, which again is, I don't know how significant this is in any meaningful sense, but my family's from Kansas. They always were. My mom and her brothers had their entire childhoods there. They never moved anywhere else. But I was born in Oklahoma City. For some reason, my grandpa had a job there or something like that. And my mom had moved down there to be with my grandpa. And for whatever reason, my mom had left the state at the exact time I was born. And 3 months after I was born, we moved back to Kansas. So I have no memory or, relevant experience of Oklahoma City. I just know that I wasn't born in the place where my family's from. And that's also been a big theme in my life, is feeling like I never belong anywhere, right? Feeling like I'm always the odd one in every environment. And again, I don't know if that's related somehow, but these are just some interesting things about my birth. Is like I was born under very unusual circumstances given where I came from. And when I talk about the situation of my birth, so if I tell you about my mother and father, they were high school sweethearts. My mom was 19 when I was born. My dad was 16 or 17. And my mom was like the ultimate goody goody and my dad was like the ultimate bad boy. And I think my dad was probably the one bad thing my mom ever did. It was, I think the trauma for my mom of what happened with my dad was so extreme that she became a religious fanatic because of it. That's my own psychological take of what happened. I could be wrong, but that's what it looks like to me from the outside. Because my dad was, the ultimate bad boy. He smoked pot, drank alcohol, dropped out of school, partied, the whole thing, and my mom was the exact opposite of that. And in the few months that she and my dad were dating, she was drinking alcohol, she was partying, she was doing things. And this is the only time in her life she ever did anything like that. And I think it scared the shit out of her. But somewhere in the midst of the few months that my mom and my dad were dating, she became pregnant. And while she was pregnant, my father ended up dropping out of school, getting kicked out of his house, and he was living with his best friend named Alan, who later basically became like one of my uncles. And he was living with Alan at the time. And Alan and his mother were moving to Florida, and they said to my dad, "Do you want to come?" And my dad said, "Sure." And so my dad left and went to Florida while my mom was pregnant with me. And he was completely absent from my life until the age of 13, but I guess that'll be a future chapter where I get to the years I lived with my dad. But my dad was absent from my life, and I think that's been a defining characteristic too. Like, as long as I can remember, there was this longing to have a relationship with my dad. And this is someone, I know I'm not alone in this, by the way. I think, probably everybody who hears this, everybody on earth probably feels that. But it's so interesting because it's so primal. And it's not logical. Like it's deeply emotional. It's like deep, like tied to our nervous system and the wiring of our brain to crave this relationship with our parents. And I know it's because that, if we don't have that relationship as children, we die, right? So it's deeply woven into our survival. But it's just so interesting witnessing myself growing up without my father around. I had no idea who he was. Logically, the only thing I knew about him was he didn't care enough to try to be around. But for some reason, he was always a hero to me. And I know anyone who grew up without a father is probably going to relate to what I'm saying right now. But he was always a hero to me. And I'll get to this at some part in the story, but somewhere around 30 years old, I finally was able to let that go. But this need to have a relationship with my father was a defining factor of my entire life up until that point. That'll come later. When I was 5 years old, my dad came to visit for a week, and this is the only experience I had of him my entire childhood until I turned 13, aside from the occasional phone call, things like that. And that week that he was visiting, I look back on that, like it was literally the best week of my life. I was so happy. Like it touched me on such a primal level to have my dad. And I mean, he wasn't anything special. He was hanging around in his boxers, smoking cigarettes. Like my memories from that time are not anything extraordinary. But I just remember how happy I was to have him there. And most of my childhood was not that. My dad was almost never around. My relationship with him was about the occasional phone call. I would call him constantly. He would rarely answer. When he would answer, we would talk for sometimes an hour, sometimes a couple hours, and we would have good conversations. Most of the time, he didn't take the calls. And once I moved in with him later and I saw what his lifestyle is like, I knew that was intentional. He was around. He just didn't want to be on the phone. So, in absence of my father, I had my mother. And my mom is an interesting person. She's very much the helpless parent archetype. And for anyone who's done my challenge, or if we've talked about the various wounded parental archetypes, there's one called the helpless archetype, and that's definitely my mom. And my mom is, even to this day, our relationship is strained right now, and it's because some things have happened, and I may or may not share more about this, but some things have happened that it's difficult for me to tolerate, and it's difficult for me to want to allow my daughter to have a relationship with her. And my mom is heartbreaking because she's the sweetest, kindest person you'd ever meet. But she has no sense of agency, no sense of responsibility. And she has become a sponge for toxic influences. And as a result, her life is so toxic that it's something I don't know how to relate with. I actually feel like I was blessed, and that in many ways I got the best of my mom, and I have 4 younger sisters, and I think I had a pretty traumatic childhood, and I'll share what it was like in this story. And when I look at my 4 younger sisters, their childhoods were infinitely more traumatic than mine were. It's because I was the oldest. My second sister under me is 7 years younger, and then the next one after that is like 15 or 16 years younger than me. So there are pretty big gaps in age between us. And these were, different marriages my mom was in. So there was kind of this honeymoon phase in my very early childhood where my grandparents were around. We had this stable place to be, this stable support system. I was very close to my grandparents. In fact, when I think of my youngest days, I don't have memories of my mother singing me to sleep, but it was my grandmother. And one of my clearest, most early memories is like laying there with my grandmother and her singing me to sleep. I think she did this every night. And my grandmother was like my rock. I mean, she was like my favorite person in the whole world. And like I said, we moved away little by little. So when I was 3 years old, we lived in the same town. When I was 5 years old, we lived a couple hours away. And by the time I was 9 years old, we lived several states away. Another thing that was characteristic of my childhood was I moved schools every single year, sometimes multiple times a year, from preschool to 4th grade. My mom was a college student, so a lot of my early memories are being dropped off with various friends, spending a lot of time in daycare, shuffled around a lot. Like, my mom she was a very loving mother wherever she wasn't operating from a really religious iron fist, which was the other side of her, she was very loving. She was very sweet. She was very empathetic. And that was a big thing with my mom, was this constant dichotomy where I didn't know who I was going to get. Was I going to get the wrath of God, or was I going to get my sweet, loving mother? And I think in my youngest years, and this is why I say I was born into kind of a honeymoon phase, in my youngest years, I had that sweet, loving mother. That's who she was. That's who I remember. But right around age 7 or 8, that started to change more and more and more. And she started to become this very rigid, very oppressive, very controlling person. And so much of my childhood is defined by a constant war with my mother. The further we got away from my grandparents, the further I left that bubble of security. I remember being thrown into daycare, which some of my earliest memories of being dropped off at daycare are very traumatic. And I have no idea what the reality of these situations was, where we recreate memory based on how it felt at the time, not based on how it actually was, right? So when I think back to these daycares, I remember being very small in this big yard full of hundreds of kids, and it was dangerous and it was chaotic, and it probably wasn't as extreme as I remember it, but I just remember that was the emotional experience of it. And for the first 3 years of my life, I was with my grandma every day. And then we moved away, and then we moved further away, and then I started getting dropped off at these places while my mom was going to school and going to work. And I just remember getting shuffled around a lot. And I want to say, like, this isn't, I don't blame my mom. She was a 19-year-old. She was doing the best she possibly could. I know my mom worked her ass off to take care of me, and I'm deeply grateful for that. And yet, these experiences left a certain impression in me. And then when I started school in preschool, and then I went to a different place for kindergarten, and a different place for first grade, and a different place for second grade, and a different place for third grade, and sometimes multiple places in one year. And there was this constant theme where I would enter an environment, and just as I was starting to get my feet on the ground, I would change environments again. And I actually spent my entire early childhood thinking that I wasn't cool, I wasn't popular, I didn't belong. That's who I thought I was. When I was going into fourth grade, when I was about 9 years old, my mom got a job in Arizona, and we moved out to Arizona from Kansas. So I had been moving constantly around Kansas, and then we made a big move all the way out to Arizona. And for the first time there, I was in the same place for 4 years, from fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, and seventh grade. And I realized for the first time, I actually do know how to fit in. The first year was hard. The first year I got picked on and cornered into the back fence of the schoolyard, and kids threw rocks at me. And the first year was hard, but the second year I wasn't starting from nothing. And by the third year, I was really solid. I had a lot of friends, and that was, these 4 years were actually the best part of my entire childhood that I remember. Socially, anyway. I had a really solid group of friends. I never had that before. I was always the outcast. I was always the weird new kid who didn't fit in. But for these 4 years, I had a really solid group of friends. For these 4 years, I was somewhat popular in the school. Like, everybody knew me, and most people liked me, and I got along, and it was a really positive environment. But the backdrop of that environment was an intensifying of pressure that had been building for the last decade between me and my mom. And so in my public life at school with my friends, I was this kind of cool kid, and I got along well, and you know, I had this certain persona. And it was like I was living a double life, because at home I was living under this oppressive, strict religious situation. And it wasn't religion that I ever had a problem with. It wasn't church. It wasn't like, I liked going to church. I liked the people at church. It was a fun place to be. There were lots of girls at church. Like, church was great. And even the people there were really nice. And I don't know what all of their personal lives were like, but it was a nice place to be. I didn't mind church. I didn't mind the religion. But it was the way that my mom used it to erase my individuality. She started from, you know, I think there were things like, I remember being like 2 or 3 years old, and my mom deciding like, I don't think you should watch Batman. And I don't think you should watch Power Rangers. And it started when I was very young, like my mom just auditing my life through this hyper-religious filter of what she thought was acceptable and what wasn't. And it was like she had this idea of who I was supposed to be as this good little Mormon boy. And everything that I was put through that filter, and she tried to erase any part that didn't fit in with that. And honestly, that's not who I am at all. So it's like my entire individuality and my entire identity was always trying to be erased. And I'm actually a very willful person, and I always have been. So I wasn't the type that allowed it to happen. And that led to a very volatile home environment. So there was a constant trend of my mom taking away everything I liked. And I always share one of the most extreme examples, but like when I would get a new CD, my mom would take it and she would lock it up in her room, and she would read the lyrics to every song in the CD. And then she would approve certain ones based on the lyrics. So if the CD had 10 songs on it, she might approve of 4 of them. And she might say, you can listen to these 4 songs. You can't listen to the other 6. And she would only allow me to listen to it when she could be in the room and the CD would be on and she could make sure I was only listening to the songs. This was the type of micromanagement that every aspect of my life was put under. And it was so oppressive. It was so suffocating. Everything I liked, from television to music to personal interests to books I wanted to read. I used to read a lot as a kid. Like, I wasn't allowed to read Harry Potter for years. And then finally my mom ended up giving in, but it's like, just, I was so restricted and I wasn't allowed to be me. And it's not just about the media and the music. I mean, that was a big part of it because that was a big part of my exploration in the world that was completely stifled. But it was also the attitude. It was like I was living under this constant attitude that she had that was so dismissive of any part of me that didn't fit in with who she thought I was supposed to be. Like, I'll give an example. There was this girl, I won't say her name, but a girl that I was, she was like my girlfriend at the time when I was, 10, 11, 12, younger. And, we had an ongoing off and on relationship for multiple years. And I really loved this girl as much as you can at, 10, 11, 12 years old. And I remember saying to my mom one day, like, I was just trying to express how I felt about this girl. And I was saying, I didn't really have the words for it, but I was like, I really like her. And I don't know, I just feel something about her. I was trying to express how I felt for this girl. And my mom said, I know what you're saying. You're saying one day you want to convert her to Mormonism and bring her to the temple and marry her. And I was like, that's actually not what I was saying at all. Like, it was such a ridiculous thing for my mom to say. Like, the last thing I was thinking about was converting this girl to Mormonism. I was a young boy having a genuine experience, and my mom couldn't even be available to that without putting it through the filter of who she needed me to be. And that was a constant theme throughout my entire life. I remember my one time we were at the grocery store and there was it was like a women's health magazine or something. There was a woman in a bikini on the front, and I'm standing there just looking at this magazine, and my mom comes up and she's like, "What are you looking at?" And I was like, "Oh, it's just a health magazine." And she's like, "Oh yeah, of course, it has a half naked woman on the front." And it's like, well, yeah, but like, first of all, I'm a 12-year-old boy. Like, shouldn't I be interested in that? And it was like immediate shaming for the fact that there was even a sexual aspect of me that existed, because it didn't fit in with who she thought I was supposed to be. And so when I was younger, I mostly complied. I mean, I didn't have a choice, but as I got older, and especially when I got to be 10, 11, 12, 13, and I started to really feel like, I'll never forget that feeling. It was, let me put it this way, and I'll share what it was like to live with my dad later, but my dad was absolute no rules, chaos, drugs, alcohol, the whole thing. And living with my dad was very traumatic. But to this day, I will say living with my dad was so much better than living with my mom. And my mom's supposedly the good one. But with my dad, I felt like I could at least be who I wanted to be, even if I was completely alone and unsupported. With my mom, I felt like I wasn't allowed to be myself. And it was an absolutely suffocating environment. And what was happening for me at that time was I had to overcompensate for this double life I was living. And so I would act out more at school to prove myself. It was like I was trying to distance myself more and more from my mom. And this is the irony of my mom's parenting style, is she actually pushed me more toward everything she didn't want me to be. because the more she didn't want me to be that, the more I wanted to. And I don't think I was ever a bad kid, actually. When I look back at myself objectively, I think I was a good kid. But I became a bad kid because I had to be, to separate myself from my mother. By her never giving me permission for anything unacceptable to exist inside of me, she forced it to come out in other ways. And I started acting out at school a lot. I started getting in a lot of fights. Fighting was really important to me at that age. I would pick fights with my friends just to fight, I guess. I don't know. But I wanted to prove myself. I wanted to prove I could beat everybody up. I remember once there was this situation where a lot of you probably did this when you were in middle school or, when you were younger, but you do the whole thing where you make yourself pass out and you get a little high. Well, I had this whole group of kids in my school that I taught how to do this, and we were all doing it in the back of the classroom. And anyway, it was like several different teachers had reported this, and they'd kind of reported me as the ringleader of it. So I got brought into the office and I was interrogated by this dude called Mr. Decker, who was like the school disciplinarian. And it was, he ended up actually getting, I think, arrested for child pornography later. But it was just this really fucked up situation where I was like, he took me into this closet and he like cornered me in the back corner of this closet. And I was like this little 13-year-old kid and he's towering over me, this giant guy, and screaming in my face. It was just this really weird, inappropriate situation. But anyway, like I was getting into a lot of trouble. I was getting into a lot of fights. I was, doing this whole thing, we're all making ourselves pass out. And I would, it kind of became a joke where I would try once a day to get sent to the principal's office, and they'd be like, all right, Shane's back today. And, it got to a point where this was in 7th grade. There was this kid who, we had some beef going on, and I don't really even know where it started. Honestly, I didn't even know the kid. I think it was instigated by some friends, and they were kind of pitting us against each other. And then he started dating my ex-girlfriend. And anyway, I had some beef going on with this kid, and we were on a field trip. And long story short, I kind of assaulted this kid on the field trip playfully. I didn't punch him in the face or anything, but I like tackled him and threw him on the ground, and just, I was just kind of testing my limits with him. And, the next day, his parents came into the office, and my mom was called into the office, and it was Mr. Decker and the principal, and they sat us down, and basically, long story short was they told my mom that this plus the fact that he's constantly in trouble, we're just going to kick him out of the school. And they gave my mom the opportunity to withdraw me voluntarily so that an expulsion didn't go on my record. And that was when I got kicked out of school in 7th grade. This was like the climax of a several years long building pressure of me feeling totally suffocated and me acting out more and more and more and more and more. And it ended up blowing up a lot at home with my mother. And I wanted to go to one school. She wanted me to go to another. There was a lot of arguing back and forth, and I don't remember the details of how everything happened, but I know one night in a heated argument, my mom said, if you hate living with me so much, why don't you go live with your dad? And I said, I will. And I picked up the phone and I called my dad and I said, hey, Mom says I can come live with you. Is that cool? And he said, sure, come on down. I went back into the kitchen and I told my mom, I said, Dad says I can come live with him. So are you going to go back on your word now? And she was like, what? And she didn't even expect him to answer the phone, let alone say yes. I didn't expect him to say yes either, honestly, but he did. And she said, okay, I guess you can go live with him. And this was a really complex thing. For years, I couldn't understand why she did it. Why would the mom who was so rigid, like she wouldn't even let me visit my dad. My dad always said, you can come visit anytime you want. She wouldn't even let me visit my dad. And now she's letting me go live with him permanently. For a long time, I couldn't understand why she did that. And this was a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it was everything I wanted. I always wanted a relationship with my dad. It was also, I was dying to get out of my mother's house. I was so suffocated. I remember what it felt like in my body to live there every day. And I hated every second of it. But it was also like, my mom was abandoning me. And it was this very weird mix of emotions. And it took me a long time to understand why she did it. But I understand now, it's actually pretty obvious when I finally look back on it, is that she was afraid she couldn't handle me anymore. She had tried my entire life to turn me into something I wasn't. And it had reached a boiling point where she was afraid that she could no longer control me. And so she sent me away. And as I look back now, I was thinking about this the other day. I look back at my mother and my father, and I'm so fucking angry at them. And for years, I didn't feel this way. For years, I was like, they're human beings too. They're flawed. They have their stuff. Nobody's perfect. They did the best they could with the knowledge they had, and I forgave them for all of it. And I wasn't holding on to any of it, but something has changed now that I'm a father. Because I look at how I'm raising Mila, and not just how I'm raising her, because I know I have a lot to learn and that's going to change over time. But I look at my level of commitment to her, my dedication to protecting her, not just protecting her physically, but protecting her identity, like protecting her self-expression, giving her permission to be who she wants to be in her life. And also physically, right? Like protecting her physically and giving her a safe environment to grow up in. And I look at my parents and I'm so fucking angry at them because I'm like, how could nobody feel that way about me? My dad disappeared and my mom tried to make me into something I wasn't. And again, I don't blame them. It's a weird situation because I get it too. But it's more like now that I'm a father, I look at it and I feel this deep anger. For like, how could you not feel the way about me that I feel about Mila? And 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to go live with my dad. The abruptness of it was intense too, because my entire life, he had been someone that I occasionally had a phone call with. Now, all of a sudden, I'm going to live with him. And just the abruptness of, one comment my mom made, and then 5 minutes later, I'm on the phone with my dad. 2 weeks later, I'm on a plane going to Florida. I never really had a relationship with my mom after that. Not in any real way. The occasional visit, that's been it. It was like my entire life up until that point disappeared in a second. Which is also a theme in my life. I've done that quite a few times. There's one person I want to mention, just because it feels significant. And before I start getting into what my life was like with my dad, there was a part of my childhood that was very significant, especially for the work I do as a relationship coach. And I want to share about a girl named Solana. When my mom joined the church, she had a friend who was kind of like her role model or mentor. in the church. And, you know, again, like most of the people I knew at church were not like this, but this woman was another extreme fundamentalist. And she's the blueprint that my mom got, basically, for how to be a Mormon. And I don't need to say much about her. You know, she was, I think, largely related to a lot of the trauma I had in childhood, and she and I never really got along very well. But that's not the important part of the story. The important part of the story was she had, I think, 7 kids, and I grew up very close to those kids. These were like my cousins growing up. We were very close. We spent all the time together. And there was one of them, Solana, who was my first girlfriend at 7 years old. I guess what's important about this experience to name was when I was 7, I think she was 8 or 9. She's a couple years older than me. But we went on a road trip together, and we basically drove from Kansas to Utah and back over the course of a couple of weeks. And we were like living out of a car together, me and it was my mom, her friend, I think 6 of her 7 kids, and me. So it was a full car. And somewhere on this trip, me and Solana expressed that we had a crush on each other, and we ended up being, you know, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever that means at 7 years old. But there was this really pure, innocent love between us that went on for many years. And shortly after that, they actually moved to Utah. I guess this is significant to me because it was like my first experience of love got ripped away from me over and over and over again. And I wasn't old enough to really understand what was happening to me. Like I couldn't really process the heartbreak I was feeling. But it was like me and her, we had this deep love. And I mean, it's hard to even say it was romantic, but we loved each other. We really did. And it started at, 7, 8 years old, and it went on, I'd say, until I moved to Florida. And it was this thing where we would only periodically see each other. I remember she came to visit me when I was like 12 years old, and I had a girlfriend at the time, and my girlfriend ended up breaking up with me because of her, just because of the connection we had with each other. My girlfriend at the time couldn't handle it. And it was like this deep love that was one of the purest things in my entire childhood. And she moved away when I was 7. And then I would see her for like a week at a time or a week or 2 at a time here. And it's like, we would pick up right where we left off. There was just this deep love between us. And I would just get heartbroken over and over again. She'd come stay at my house for a week. We would have this week together. We would fall in love all over again. And then she would leave, and I would get heartbroken all over again. And I don't know. I think that's formative on some level. It shaped me in a lot of ways. And then our relationship really ended when I moved in with my dad at 13. The next time I saw her after that, she was married. So I think this is a good place to pause it for today. But I want to say, if you made it this far in the episode, thank you for listening. I know this isn't for everyone, and it's not intended to be, but if you're interested in the history of who I am and where this work truly comes from, this is the answer to that. And to my daughter, who one day is listening to this is who I was before you were here. One other thing I want to share that I'm really excited about is in the next week or 2, I'm going to be opening up the Anchor community. This is going to be a low-cost monthly membership where you will get a personalized experience around your relational blueprint, and you and I will be able to have a close, ongoing relationship with each other. So if that's something you're interested in, I'm going to put together a special offer specifically for you as a podcast listener. So just stay tuned in the next couple weeks as I'll be sharing more info about that. and tune in next month for part 2 of my life story. So again, thank you if you made it this far in the episode. Lots of love to all of you, and I'll see you back here next week. Take care. Bye. Is there something you'd like to sit down and talk to me about face to face? If so, here's how we can do that. Every week, I open my schedule for 1 or 2 private calls with potential clients. And if it's your first time meeting with me, I offer that session at a discounted rate of $250. Go to inspiredloveapproach.com/private coaching to book that session now, or just click the link in the show notes. And if you still don't know what your relational blueprint is, make sure to take the quiz and find out. You can find the link below as well. And after you take the quiz, I'll send you a personalized video breaking down your blueprint in detail. If you enjoy the Conscious Love Show, the best way you can support us is to follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're listening. It helps improve the ranking and get the work out to more people. Thanks for listening today, and I'll see you next time.